to.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Ernie, for having me. It's a pleasure to join the FIPCO Virtual Community Health Fair today. I am delighted to share my experience as a frontline worker taking care of the very ill, critically ill COVID-19 patients in the ICU here at Banner University Medical Center in Tucson. My name is Christian Bimi. I'm an associate professor of medicine at the University of Arizona in Tucson in the Division of Pulmonary Allergy, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine. I'm also the medical director of the medical ICU here in Tucson. And as I mentioned, I've had a lot of experience dealing at the front lines of care for critically ill patients with the COVID-19 severe disease. This presentation is part of our ongoing community engagement work, which is actually partly funded by the National Institutes of Health. It's called the SEAL Alliance, which stands for Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities. It's part of an NIH $12 million initiative for 11 states across the country that's focused on those states that have disproportionately affected communities. I'll cover a few topics in this discussion. We'll talk about health disparities during the COVID-19 pandemic, an overview of the social determinants of health, talk about vaccine hesitancy and how vaccines are made and why we should be reassured, and then talk about some initiatives to address vaccine-related health inequities. And then after that, I'll be happy to take some questions from the audience and have a discussion related to these important topics. So first of all, a summary of COVID-19 related data. Almost 30 million cases at this time. This is data from February 15, so the numbers have changed. And more than 500,000 deaths so far. About 15% of the United States population is currently vaccinated. And as you know, we have two approved vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which are two-dose vaccines. There is good news. As of yesterday, the expert panel recommended that the FDA approve the Johnson & Johnson single-dose vaccine. And so another vaccine is imminent, and that will be very, very important as we continue to encourage people to get vaccinated. Overall, I would say that the numbers are trending downwards across the country. But as you can see, as recently as 2 or 3 weeks ago, Southern California and Arizona are still very hotspots, as shown in these very dark blue spots. These are the areas where the numbers were still critically high. In fact, Arizona has actually been the capital of new cases of COVID-19 for the past few months. And so it is very important that we in Southern Arizona, we take this very seriously. There are some concerns, though, with regard to the new strains that have been identified in several countries, and specifically the concern that these new strains might not be susceptible or might not, the vaccines that we have might not protect as well against these new strains. These are actively being studied at this time. Another concern is that although the overall total number of cases have been coming down, we are seeing that there may be some leveling out at a high plateau, and that is concerning. We do not know if this is related to the new variants that tend to spread much easily than the original strains of the virus. So these things are concerning. As much as these global numbers paint a global picture, they do not tell the whole story. There are glaring race and ethnic disparities with regard to hospitalizations. As you can see here, racial and ethnic minorities, so Native Americans, non-Hispanic, Black, and Hispanics or Latino are significantly more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19 compared to non-Hispanic whites or Pacific Islanders. That data is confirmed when you look at the number of patients who die from COVID-19. This is a study that my colleagues and I published in July. And at the time, we looked at the percent of people who die from COVID-19 compared to the percent of that racial or ethnic group in the overall population. As you can see here for Blacks in the United States overall and across multiple states, we had a greater share of the mortality compared to the share of the population for Blacks. Similar trends for Latinx folks, as well as for Native Americans. As you can see, Arizona and New Mexico, states that have high Native American populations, showed these trends. And so we are seeing clearly that there are glaring disparities with regards to hospitalizations and deaths from COVID-19. These health disparities are not new. So patients who die from severe COVID-19 die from respiratory failure, which is what causes us to have to put people on the ventilator. The disease is called acute respiratory distress syndrome. And we've known this for many years. This is a study that was published in 2009, and I subsequently in my group confirmed these findings in another study. And basically it shows that compared to white folks, if you have ARDS, you're almost 1.5 times more likely to die from ARDS compared to whites. And if you're Hispanics, you're almost twice as likely to die. And so this is data that is being amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic just because of the volume of cases that we're seeing. What are the determinants of health? Why is it that we're seeing all of these problems? Well, the problem is that these patients who end up having ARDS and ending up in the hospital have multiple reasons that predate their current state. We call them the determinants of health because they are indeed just that. There are individual-based components, there are community-based historical components, and there are hospital-based factors. And some of these factors intersect. If you look at socioeconomic status, you can agree with me that it really merges everything and goes into some of the historical concerns that people of color have always dealt with, which leads to some of these poor outcomes. So although my research focuses on genetics, I am very aware that there are multiple factors, socioeconomic status being one of them. But if you look at hospital-based factors, the delivery and the quality of care also has something to do with it. If you look at preventive health management, community-based factors, to what extent do we have those resources to be able to offer the kind of long-term preventive health management that would mitigate the effects of, critical illness on these populations. So in trying to address that, my group and I looked at many factors. We wanted to put together this complex slide as a way to guide us as we think about these complex problems, because it is not as easy as it might seem. Look at this table, we kind of broke it down in terms of pre-disease conditions that increase the risk of COVID-19 transmission. We look at the conditions that increase the risk of poor outcomes when you do get the disease or get the infection, and then the post-disease conditions, looking at long-term outcomes. And as we break it down, you think about exposure, care access, care delivery, discharge, and long-term care. You can begin to identify those social determinants by each of these different groups. Take, for example, transportation. How many of our racial and ethnic minority groups have good access to those preventive care? Occupation, are we able to work from home like most people can do? So if you have an occupation, if you're an essential worker in a city like New York, and your income depends on you having to be at work, regardless of the risk that you have to take, then you have to be at work to be able to put food on the table. We look at housing, multi-generational households. So the younger folks, we know when they get COVID-19 tend to do well. But what if they take the infection and go home and infect their grandparents with whom they live in a multi-generational home? Those are all things that are concerning. We talk about technology being able to teach kids from home. Well, how many of those children have internet at home that's reliable? How many of them have computers? And so on and so forth. You know, you look at insurance access. Do you have the kind of job that offers the benefits that include insurance? And so this is our way of saying that this is a multifactorial problem that requires a multifaceted collaborative approach. And so as we think about this as a community, this slide becomes what we think of as a starting point for those discussions, understanding that this is a complex problem that requires a complex social collaboration, with community leaders, us healthcare providers, public health experts, as well as the government. I'm now going to switch gears and talk about vaccine hesitancy, because this is very important. The concept of vaccine hesitancy or skepticism is not a new phenomenon. We've dealt with this for many, many years, ever since vaccines started becoming commonplace. And vaccines have been very useful. We know that because we've successfully eradicated many diseases, but that's not without controversy. If you look at what I'm showing here on this graph, you can tell that the surveys of people regarding this COVID-19 vaccines from May through November has been fluctuating, but overall, about 40 to 49% of the respondents were either saying they would probably not or definitely not take the COVID-19 vaccine. Well, this is not very different. If you look here, the United States has historically ranged in the 50 to 60% range in terms of not agreeing that, the flu vaccine is safe. And so we're still looking at the same proportion of almost 40 to 50% patients who were generally hesitant about vaccines leading up to this time. So this is not a new phenomenon. In fact, we thought that these numbers would be much higher, but it turns out if you compare, it's pretty much in the same range of vaccine hesitancy. Well, one of the concerns that I've heard about, the questions that tend to come up is, well, these new technologies, they've not been well tested, and are there some risks that could occur? So I'm trying to give a summary of how different vaccine designs, there are 8 vaccine designs here. And as you can tell, we're not using the traditional live attenuated vaccine. So you're not going to get the live virus that would make you sick. We're using components of the virus. So the Moderna vaccine uses what we call messenger RNA, which is just a template of instructions that tells the cells of the body to then make the spike protein. And when the body creates those spike proteins, then the immune system of the body, which normally fights disease, is going to build those antibodies that help prevent disease. You have monoclonal antibodies, which is actually a non-vaccine. You must have heard about the Regeneron monoclonal antibodies, or the ones from Lilly. And those ones are monoclonal antibodies that essentially do the job of directly mitigating the virus from integrating into the cells and causing the infection. So another preventive strategy. There are other ways to make a vaccine. The Novak Sanofi uses a subunit protein. The AstraZeneca uses a recombinant viral vector. And then others use synthetic peptides. So we have different ways of making these vaccines. And so overall, this technology, although it seems new, has actually been tested and facilitated by extensive research in the field of genomics over the past 15 to 20 years. If you look at the impact of vaccines in the United States, you can tell that we have been successful for the traditional diseases to eradicate cases mostly, and this is thanks to the efficacy of traditional vaccines. If you look at these efficacies, you would agree with me that what is being reported for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines is pretty decent. When we're talking about 95% efficacy, that is pretty good, because you're in the range of the efficacy of pertussis and diphtheria. So we are in very good company with these new vaccines, and we'll see what happens with the new strains. So some questions that have come up what could the vaccine do? How beneficial would it be? Well, number one, it would reduce the severity of the illness such that if you did get infected, you wouldn't be very sick. Although the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is being reported as between 65 to 70% effective, that is just for preventing the infection. But in terms of preventing severe critical illness and death, it's 100%. So that is very good. In terms of a benefit to the community, well, reducing the rate of transmission would lead to healthier communities and less stress on the healthcare systems. I can tell you that, as a head of the ICU, I walk around and talk to my colleagues, my nurses, my respiratory therapists. They are tired, they are exhausted. Remember, we've been working at the front lines continuously for 1 year now. We also have families, we have lives, so we do not want to stress our healthcare system to the point of breaking. And we also have to remember that, I am a pulmonary doctor as well as an intensive care doctor, which means that I also see patients in clinic. When I'm spending the majority of my time in the ICU, those patients that I would have been seeing in clinic for their lung cancer, for their COPD, for their asthma, for all kinds of pulmonary conditions, I wouldn't have the time to see them or to see them well enough. And so those diseases are not well taken care of. We could talk about all the other specialties. And so the healthcare system was not designed to run with such a high stressor for a very long time. Another question that tends to come up often is the typical stages of clinical testing for vaccines and the concern that maybe these new vaccines were rushed. Well, I can assure you that these vaccines have gone through all the traditional phases, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies. It is true that traditionally, these phases would take long. Phase 1 would be typically 12 to 18 months of preclinical, small group of healthy participants to test the safety. And then phase 2 would be up to 2 years of hundreds of healthy participants to test if there's an immune response going on and maybe early safety signal. And then finally, the phase 3, which is hundreds of thousands of participants and testing for safety and efficacy as well. Well, there are a few things that happened with COVID-19. So with the Operation Warp Speed, what happened was that there was a lot of synergy among scientists across the world. And we had a lot of knowledge from the previous SARS, COVID-1, as well as the MERS viral infections in the Mediterranean areas, where we already had good information about the genetic sequence of this virus. In addition to that, being able to sequence the genes of viruses, or all genes for that matter, has become very, very efficient. It used to be 20 years ago that it took many, many months to be able to sequence the genes of a virus. Nowadays, we can sequence it in a week. And so we were able to get the genetic sequence for this virus very quickly. And so the scientists were able to get to work very quickly using the templates from the earlier SARS viruses that were similar. We already knew that if you targeted the spike proteins, that you would be able to generate a robust immune system. We already knew how this virus integrates into the cells by using the ACE2 receptors. So that knowledge facilitated early development that led to early phase 1 studies. Another thing to mention in our ability to get the vaccine so quickly was that normally if a company were to go through this process, they will go through the process and then seek approval. Once they get approval, they start manufacturing because they don't want to take the risk. They don't want to take the risk of getting the of manufacturing the product prior to getting the approval. If it fails, then they'll have a loss to their balance sheet. Where the government helped by assuring them, kind of giving them an insurance that they could start manufacturing after the very early phases of their analysis. Once we knew that these patients in the early phase studies were building immunity, that the companies could start manufacturing. And that is why as soon as the vaccines were approved, we had enough doses ready. Another question that tends to come up, can vaccines cause the SARS-CoV-2 infection or cause COVID-19 disease? Well, the answer is no. The vaccines being tested are made from, like I said, synthetic, pieces from the SARS-CoV-2, not the whole virus. I mean, the analogy would be that if you have the parts of a bicycle separately, they do not equal a full bicycle. You'd have to have a full bicycle assembly. Well, in this case, for the virus, we're just talking about, the messenger RNA for one aspect of it, or maybe, just synthetic peptides. So in that case, you do not have the full virus. So you're not at risk for getting the infection or getting the disease from the vaccine. That does not mean that safety is not a concern. Safety is always a concern. There are always unknown unknowns. And that is why we do large-scale studies and we do post-study follow-up. I got my vaccine, and after that, I had multiple emails from the CDC. In fact, you get text messages and then you go and respond. They're asking about symptoms. So if you participate in that V-Safe, they call it a V-Safe program, then you can respond and give symptoms that you have. That way, the CDC will be able to tell what people are experiencing. And I believe it's a very good program to just directly sample people who are getting the vaccine to get a sense of what is actually happening. That way, we can quickly identify some of those very rare complications that might not have been identified when they did the phase 3 clinical studies. I'm going to just briefly talk about, something that is very important. There are warning flags for racial inequalities in terms of vaccination. If you look at this slide, we're looking at multiple states here. You can see that in the dark blue, these are the rates of vaccination, and then the number of cases of COVID-19, number of deaths, and as a percentage of the population. And you can see that Black people across multiple states are bearing the brunt of the disease, highest number of cases and deaths, but we are not represented proportionately, at least in terms of the disease severity in the Black community. We are not getting as much vaccination. That is a red flag, and that is something that needs to change. We have heard reports that the availability of vaccination sites in certain communities of color, are not adequate. And that is something that policymakers are working hard to address very quickly. As a community, we are coming together to make sure that we do our part to encourage our people to step up, understand the consequences, the importance of taking this vaccine, and the consequences of not taking the vaccine. But at the same time, the leaders, the public health leaders, the politicians need to work hard to make sure that our communities have enough access to these vaccination sites. And, I'm going to open it up for questions at this time. And if there are none, I'll maybe answer some of the questions that have generally come to my mind. So I'll open it up if there are any other questions. And thank you so much.
All right, great job, Dr. Bemi.
Thank you, Ernie.
All right. For anyone who's watching this film, they can get more resources at our Hope and Help Room, located on the website. That's www.easthillstream.com/FIPCO. Thank you. Oh, we do have one question. All right. There's someone here that has a question. Let me. All right. One question. Here we go. Yes.
All right. Dr. Bemi, and you may have covered it and I missed it, but what would be your position for those who are naysayers, if you will, about the vaccine? I mean, we know that, yes, there are issues about access and availability and all of that, but there's also not a small number of people who are resistant for any number of reasons. And in the Black and brown community, there's the issue about history of research and vaccines and trials and all of that. And if you've done it already, I apologize, but maybe you can speak to that again about what should be our perspective about the reality of history. So you can't deny that it happened, Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and the like, and versus the realities of where we are today, being told that we should get vaccinated.
That's a great question. It's a question that comes up a lot. It is not, there's no denying that historically we've had some very serious atrocities
Right.
with regard to science and medicine. Tuskegee comes to mind, but there are many, many other examples, countless examples. And for those reasons, and not only those cases, but just the historical, traditional inequalities that I've mentioned in the talk earlier. And you put those together and you could see why there's this skepticism among Black and brown communities. The way I respond to this is that in the context of this pandemic, we have to be careful not to let this skepticism lead to a propagation of the same inequalities that we worry about. And so I would say that, in terms of participation in the studies, all races participated. And I was delighted when I looked at the data that, contrary to what we thought going in, that there was a decent proportion of Blacks that participated in the Pfizer and Moderna trials. They were up to 10% in each case, maybe 11%, which is not very far from the population, from the percent of Blacks in the United States population. That's good news. That means that we have enough representation. We would have loved to have more, but the majority of the participants were white. And as you can tell, a lot of people are clamoring to get this vaccine. So if it was something that was targeted, with nefarious intentions, then it wouldn't be everybody rushing to get it. So just from that perspective, from the fact that this is a pandemic that happened and, a lot of Black and brown people are dying, I would say that, those fears, as real as they may be, do not quite apply here. These studies were done across all populations. They were transparent. The results were transparent. And so I think that, we have to always be cautious, but at the same time, be careful not to let our extreme caution, our hesitancy, propagate health disparities going forward.
Excellent. Once again, Dr. Bemi, we appreciate your presentation. If anyone would like to get resources, we do have resources at the Hope and Help Room at easthillstream.com/FIPCO. You will also receive a survey within the coming days to let us know a little bit about what you've experienced during this weekend's fair. Looking forward to getting your input. Thank you once again, Dr. Bemi, for your participation. Looking forward to hearing from all you participants. Thank you. Have a great fair.